Thank you all for joining us at the second day of the National Forum on Anti-Asian Racism, Building Solidarities. I'm Melissa Vanti, Communications Manager for the Office of the Vice President, Equity and Community Inclusion at X University, and a member of the organizing team for this forum. Before I continue on, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land. I am honored to be joining you from Toronto. This is the territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabeg, Mississaugas, and territory governed by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. This treaty has committed these nations to share the territory in peace, friendship, and respect. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in this spirit. All of us, members of the Asian diaspora, whether you identify as Chinese Canadian like myself, or as a newcomer or longtime immigrant, second, third, fourth generation, we are considered part of this category of newcomers. We are colleagues, friends, community members who are privileged to be living on this land, to be growing as individuals, growing our families, and to be benefiting from this land. This land gives of itself to us. And so we must accept this gift with reverence, with respect, and most important, with full recognition of those who have stewarded and been caretakers of this land for generations. As an East Asian woman, a second-generation Canadian by way of Hong Kong, my family did not learn about the resilience and resistance of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities in this country until much too late. Regardless of who we are, we need to be united and commit ourselves against the fight of white supremacy and systems of oppression that have and continue to impact our communities all over. These same powers are those that fuel anti-Asian racism and discrimination we face as racialized folks. If we care about anti-Asian racism, about the discrimination our communities face, we must also care about how we can all be working towards the empowerment and betterment of all equity-deserving group members. These same powers lead to fissures and challenges within the Asian community. This is not a race to the bottom. As so many activists, scholars, and leaders have said, this is about lifting one another up all together so that if you rise, we all rise. In addition to fighting against powers that oppress, we must also center creativity, artistry, expression, beauty, humanity, flourishing of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, fostering relationships, amplifying voices, honoring traditions, respecting knowledge, and lifting as we go. I stand with Indigenous peoples all over Turtle Island who right now, their very presence, histories, traditions, and imagined futures push us to envision what a more sustainable and hopeful world can be. So with that, I am going to just take a moment to acknowledge that we've had a very full 2 days of rigorous and rich conversation. And we're going to take a few moments to look back at what we've heard and learned here together. We heard from several attendees that they found yesterday's report back to be extremely helpful to reinforce key insights and to deepen the conversations with new perspectives on what resonated with them. So first up, we're going to do a quick review of the concurrent sessions. I know I had a hard time choosing which session to attend, and I'm sure some of you did as well. Hopefully this will give you a sense of what you missed for now, because of course you will be able to watch all the recordings and the sessions soon online. As we did yesterday, we're going to do these rapid fire. So each of the speakers is going to introduce themselves, identify the concurrent session they are speaking to, and share their one key takeaway from that session. Let's start with Ivy with concurrent session number 6.
Thank you, Mel, for opening. Hi, everyone. My name is Ivy Locke. I'm a second-year law student at X University's Lincoln Alexander School of Law. So the session that I'll be debriefing centered around the ethics of representing Asian communities in research. I know we're supposed to share one key takeaway, but I have quite a few as our speakers had very valuable insights. These stories and the discussion offered a lot of insight into the ethics of representing racialized communities as a whole, even though our speakers shared a lot of their personal experiences as Japanese Canadians. So a lot of the conversation centered around the struggles of our speakers and being able to fit their research within the existing power structure of a discipline that has been established by white scholars and therefore reflect the influences of white supremacy, colonialism, and the hegemony of white scholarship. There is a consensus from our speakers that there is a dominance of white scholars that are leading discussions on the issues and histories of Japanese Canadians. And this, coupled with the growing expectations of diversity, has only created tokenistic and surface level representation. And this has only contributed to the exploitation of Japanese Canadian scholars who are in the discipline. So an important point that was brought up in the discussion and in the chat was that the critique of academic and research projects are not a critique of the experiences and the work of researchers themselves. Sometimes there's little choice but to participate in exploitation that can be framed as an opportunity. And the work is invaluable, but the treatment of racialized researchers should be critiqued and questioned. Our speakers ended off with ideas on how to move forward. And an emphasis was placed on supporting new scholars, on diversifying how we tell our stories, who is telling our stories, and how the connections can be made through the work of Japanese Canadians and into other communities. So thank you, and Mel, going to pass the mic back to you.
Thank you so much, Ivy, for that very detailed talk back. I wish I'd been at that session. So next I'm going to give it over to Gaaya, who's going to give us a report back of concurrent session number 7.
Thank you, Mel. Hello, everyone. My name is Gaaya. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm an art student at X University. But today I'm here to report back on concurrent session 7, Building Alliances to Confront Anti-Asian Racism. And it was an incredibly insightful session that brought to light how charitable organizations, corporations, and higher education intersect in their efforts of supporting anti-Asian racism. The panelists were incredibly productive, suggesting very obtainable solutions, such as having nonprofit and charitable representatives in curriculum and faculty representatives in corporations. Everyone felt strongly in saying that leaders in higher education and governments alike should reflect their community. They also stressed that these seats should be held for those who are authentic to their community and have their best interests at heart, not for those who only represent themselves. And I think this is a sentiment that can definitely be resonated by those in any role and in any sector of the society. The panelists also touched upon calling in versus calling out and how to use the resources around you, whether it be social media, to challenge a narrative scripted for you and to push your own story. There's a lot of potential for alliances and togetherness that stems from resources like social media, in which you choose how you want to express yourself and interact with others. They also brought to the table a question that perhaps is something we should all keep in mind. Why do we do the things we do, and how authentic are we when helping these communities with the work we do? What initiatives are we taking outside of applying for grants or for research portfolio? As Annette and Chinmoy Chang says, we're not pawns to be used for your funding and diversity. On that note, the greatest takeaway from this compelling session was authenticity. Give space for those who are authentic to their cause and call in with yourself and ensure you are authentic with your acts. With that, I'll pass it back to Mel.
Thank you, Gaaya. Okay, Natasha, will you tell us about concurrent session 8, please?
I will. Thank you so much, Mel. My name is Natasha. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a master's student at York in political science. And I'm just going to be talking to you folks quickly about concurrent session number 8, addressing sexual violence targeted at Southeast and East Asian communities in higher education, hosted by Consent Comes First. Now, this session was absolutely incredible. All of the panelists were in agreement about a couple of things. One of the things that stood out to me most was that all of the experiences we hold are shaped by our communities through how we are supported. Some panelists spoke to the ideas of energies and how the emotional toll that is not taken into consideration by white folk is a representation of the kinds of trauma that has been caused by those very same folk through our intersectionalities, instigated as that trauma is instigated by others outside of our community. Our moderator spoke quite powerfully to collect our thoughts surrounding not being complicit, where they said, I don't want to sit down, I don't want to be quiet. We have to be able to say those kinds of things to those around us. We have to rock the boat and then support one another when we're floating in the water. We spoke about this with regards to the stigma that folks think and speak when they want to stand with sex workers, for example. The discrimination against Asian people as a result of the pandemic, many working professionals and even people who are out doing errands and going about their daily lives get discriminated against and verbally assaulted because they are Asian. That there's backlash when these communities are hit with tragedy instead of support that is state inflicted. And so in order to support our students and support learning through these spaces, we must ensure that we build a community that sort of encompasses all of the support needed for our students as they go about their daily experiences with racism. Professional leaders from Asian communities are paving the way for underestimated groups by having more discussions, taking up more space at all levels and institutions to really build solidarities with one another. Our panelists spoke about using that particular experience and seeing self-care as well as peer support as strengths instead of weaknesses to deal with these kinds of injuries. Back to you, Mal.
Thank you so much, Natasha. And I'm going to take on concurrent session number 9. This session was called In Conversation, Equity and Community Inclusion Leaders on the Issues of Racism. And it was a really intimate conversation amongst 4 senior leaders who lead equity and community inclusion at their respective universities, McMaster's, Ryerson, Queen's, and University of Manitoba. It was a really great conversation in that the leaders talked a lot about some of the opening challenges, and that with regards to these offices and these leaders, oftentimes they're at a place where they open conversations amongst people as an entry point to EDI, but they're also perceived and conceived of as barriers when they are the ones saying no or pushing back, so to speak, on conversations or on initiatives in an effort to protect the communities that might be harmed. They acknowledge that within the universities, there are people who are taking on initiatives that might be performative, action bias, box ticking, and they have to be the ones to advise that they shouldn't do it. And Stephanie Simpson of Queens shared that they're often labeled as barriers to advancing people's ideas. Dr. Denise O'Neill Green from our university said something succinct, which was ultimately they're there to disrupt the status quo or status quota, be they Asian, Indigenous, Black, or from other racialized groups, and disrupting and calling people in to keep certain initiatives from happening to reduce harm is so often a part of that work. A really big point that stood out for me was conversations about how vital working in community and in a grassroots way is so vital. All members acknowledge that their very offices and initiatives that they have led would not have happened had community members demanded accountability. So, for all of us out there, it speaks to the power that we all have as members of the university community to advocate, agitate, disrupt, and to really push power to be held accountable and push the university to be held accountable. It was interesting because there was a conversation about power and the way in which power is actually quite fluid often. And so that was really fascinating. There was also conversations about the way in which, of course, institutions have a tendency to perhaps, focus on words more than actions. And so, a true need for more resources, especially. Many of the offices, the 4 offices really ranged. One of our colleagues shared that, they're actually only one person in a whole university consulting on equity and community inclusion initiatives, which is truly astounding that you would have one specialist in this area for a whole community. And just speaking about the ways in which there certainly just aren't enough resources in this work overall. And the investment in those resources is really critical, especially when you're being held accountable by community. There was a rich discussion about the, of course, really horrible, but also, moment in time that we're in after George Floyd was murdered, and how that has really made an impact on a lot of people to pay attention to issues around white supremacy, racism, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Asian racism, and so on. And, the idea that we need to use this momentum in time to push forward. The conversation did end on the idea of self-care and how people take care of one another. And Dr. Arig Shaiba from McMaster said something really great, which I'll close on. She said, networks and Netflix. That's how she focused on self-care, which I thought was a perfect way to end off. So that was concurrent session number 9. And now I'm going to pass it over to Noelle, who's going to tell us about concurrent session number 10.
Thank you,
Mel. Hi, everyone. My name is Noelle. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a third-year philosophy and history double major at X University. I will be your speaker for concurrent session number 10. In this session, panelists have conversed about precarity and racism and upward mobility in academia. One of the many things discussed in this panel is that we must aim to reconstruct institutions to tackle the bias and racism towards Asians today, so that the future generations will not burden themselves with it. Model minorities and perceptual foreigners are known mostly in the Asian community. We need to get rid of these misconceptions and not feel alone if we are the only racialized scholar in our department or school. We must learn to push from silence and move towards solidarity and focus on higher standards for contract education workers holistically. We should tackle structural and systematic racism. Be a member of a course union or a student group. Be an active member and receive information about your own elective rights. Identify progressive and radical activities on campus. Attend seminars as much as possible and go beyond your own discipline and department. It has been stressed of the need for qualitative and quantitative research on not only anti-Asian racism, but also Indigenous racism and Black racism. We should also think about the mental problems racism and precarity causes on racialized peoples. We need to continue this discussion on Asian Canadian inequality and racism. However, people who have an academic background on this need to give this to the future generation so that they can also use it to fight for self-protection and self-preservation. This session was insightful in the way to hear the panelists' experiences and what they have faced throughout their lives to be where they are right now. To speak upon such issues, we don't need more consultations. We advocate the need for action plans. Equality is one of the main headlines of this part of the conference, as most post-secondary institutions do not conduct annual equity audits and have major concurrent issues surrounding this topic. Most importantly, moving forward from this forum, we must continue to think about the future of not only ourselves, but also the future of scholars who have yet to attend these academic institutions. Thank you, Mel. I will pass it back to you now.
Thank you so much, Noelle. So that concludes the report backs from our various sessions today. Thank you so much for those quick overviews. These talkbacks really highlighted for me that these conversations are like pathways and they're far reaching, and each of us have an opportunity to really take the path that best suits us. We are all on our journeys to fight oppression, racism, white supremacy, and colonization. And another thread that I found was the idea that this work is intergenerational and based on relationships that will continue far beyond our times here. So before we let you go, I'd like to invite a few more commentators to the virtual stage to share their own reflections on the forum, including our planning co-leads who have been completely dedicated to making this forum a success. Please welcome Gabe, Josel, and Sibo, who are going to close us out, as well as introduce our senior leaders for the evening.
Thank you, Mel, and good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to join you all today as a voice from our planning team and a member of the National Forum Steering Committee to share my reflections coming out of this event. Over the past few months, I've had the pleasure and privilege of working with students, faculty, staff, and community leaders from across the country to define the focus of this forum and set the stage for the important conversations that we've heard over the last 2 days. Through our planning, we investigated the devastating impact hate, discrimination, and racism can have when they take hold of our institutions, and the many ways in which these incidents trickle into the broader community. The discussions throughout this forum were meant to shed light and deepen our collective understanding of the subtle and overt ways in which systemic racism shapes higher education. I believe we've accomplished this, having heard from voices across the university community about their lived experiences in the classroom, in the workplace, in the community, and in leadership. But I also believe we have come to understand the inherent responsibility universities and post-secondary institutions as a whole must play in addressing these issues, driving action, and being an active part of the solution. During his earlier interview with Mary Ito, UBC's President Santa Ono spoke to the incredible number of people that move through Canadian universities every year and reiterated that those same people are our country's future. They are the doctors, lawyers, creatives, and community leaders of tomorrow. And knowing the critical role universities play in teaching and guiding them, we must look at our institutions as a starting point to addressing these issues. Earlier today, during our 7th concurrent session, one of our steering committee members and a great friend of the forum, Christine Nakamura, highlighted that universities have an incredible convening power, not only in bringing together students, but also the broader community. I believe this forum is a great example of that, having seen over 1,100 registrants and over 100 speakers from Asian, Black, Indigenous, and other racialized communities. This convening power is important now more than ever before in our ultimate goal of building solidarities. This forum and the many conversations and connections that have filled it have proven that there is a desire and, in fact, a true need for communities to stand together to create the transformative change needed for a more equitable future. We know that this is only a starting point, but through collaboration, through collective ambition, and through standing together, I hope that this forum will have helped to pave a path forward for understanding, action, and equity in our universities. I'll now hand the mic over to my co-planning lead, Josel, a person whose contributions to the success of this forum cannot be stressed enough. Josel, it's been a pleasure working with you. Over to you.
Thank you, Gabe. Thank you for joining us for closing remarks as we share our reflections. I'm speaking as a Student Advisory Committee member and Planning Co-Lead for the National Forum on Anti-Asian Racism. Day 2 of this forum was filled with incredible discussions from students, faculty, staff, and community members across the country. It was filled with hard and uncomfortable conversations to confront and challenge institutions rooted in colonialism, white supremacy, oppression, and racism. We started with keynote remarks from Dr. Aiko Day. She spoke about various important topics in Asian American and Asian Canadian communities intersecting with anti-Blackness, anti-Asian racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and the capitalist social order. The impacts of historical norms seeing Asians as degenerates, US imperialism expanding into Asian countries, such as the Philippines and Taiwan, restrictive immigration policies, gender and sexual policing as a form of border control. These histories have created a ripple effect into the hyperexploitation, xenophobia, and discrimination of racialized peoples today. We sincerely thank Dr. Aiko Day for her remarks this morning, starting off day 2 of the forum on important themes. Moving on to our plenary panel sessions, we've had an insightful discussion in plenary panel number 4 on coalition building, dismantling systems of oppression to build solidarity. Our panelists approached the discussion of solidarity with an intersectional approach, talking about their lived experiences within and outside of institutions, how we define allyship, the lack of work being done to address systemic issues, and personal struggles that we have as racialized peoples, finding ourselves in these systems were continuously challenging. These experiences are everyday to us. We bring it to work, we bring it home, and we live with it as we are silenced, met with erasure and denial. However, we're slowly learning and unlearning this so-called race to the bottom. It should not be a competition, but acts of solidarity together. As our panelists said, we still have a lot of work to do. As a student, myself and the rest of that student advisory committee wanted to make sure that students' voices were heard and integrated into our individual sessions, as well as dedicating a space for a student-led panel on racialized representation in student governance and leadership. Student governance is an essential part of university institutions. Whether students are elected or appointed, their roles in the university should be held with large significance in contributing to institutional changes. We are here actively engaging and meeting students where they are to offer support and initiatives, and to address the barriers in engagement and leadership. As students, especially Asian, Indigenous, Black, and racialized students, we are unapologetically taking up spaces as an important body of the university institution. And now our last panel today was strategically placed at the end to conduct a conversation with university leaders and students to push for genuine accountability and actions. Students tend to be met with intimidation by administrators, too unapproachable for us to have conversations with. However, this panel has provided a space for us to talk to each other and address these neglected issues. Students spoke about the resistance on the privatization of universities, to make institutional language more accessible, to reduce the alienation of community members inside and outside of the university. A key takeaway was when the students asked on strategies for calling in university leaders, the answer was, it should be through a call for accountability while ensuring that there is support for equity and anti-racist work. Despite the session ending after a 75-minute conversation, we hope and aim that this conversation will continue within our own institutions. As my final words for today, I would like to encourage for everyone in the university communities to listen to Asian, Indigenous, Black, and racialized students to include our voices in as many spaces as possible to create transformative changes. Where does change start? Well, I think change has started and will continue. However, we need to push for these conversations on anti-colonialism, anti-racism, and equity through an intersectional lens to sustain and develop action plans to move forward for a thriving future together. Most importantly, before I pass it off to our next key takeaway speaker, I would like to say a huge thank you to our Faculty of Arts Dean, Pam Sugerman, for providing me and the rest of this opportunity to have a platform for these crucial conversations. Thank you to Gabriel Ciufo for being an amazing planning lead. Words cannot express how much I enjoyed working with you and appreciate how much you value students' voices. And of course, I would like to thank our logistics, research, marketing, event support, and pro-show audiovisual production team. Our early and late nights in Zoom meetings and emails have paid off well, with this national forum being a success. I can confidently say that I'm a proud queer Asian woman. Thank you. I'll now invite Sibo Chen, one of our academic advisory committee members, to share his key takeaway remarks.
Thank you, Giselle, and hi everyone. So my name is Sibo Chen. So I'm an assistant professor at School of Professional Communication of X University. So on behalf of the academic advisory committee, so I'm going to share my brief thoughts of all of the great ideas being shared over the past 2 days. So many of the points have already been elaborated. So I will be a little bit brief here. So like what Giselle mentioned, we hope that all of the great conversation already taken here is just like a beginning of the broader conversation we need, right? So even though we are kind of delivering all of this kind of reflection at the closing remarks, all these remarks should be actually milestones for us to taking the next steps. So a second kind of consensus emerging from all of the discussion is this kind of growing consensus about the intersectional nature of racism and racial discrimination. And I think there is, from all of the panelists, right, there is kind of a general consensus that, to fight against all forms of racism, we need more collaboration and we need input from multiple stakeholders. So speaking about, for example, my own research, so I'm doing research on environmental related issues, and within, environmental scholars, there has been growing concern that, climate justice will not be delivered without realizing racial justice. So this kind of intersectionality reminds us the fact that we are living in a settler colonial society, and combating this overall structure of settler colonialism is the broader task that not only, for scholars working on anti-Asian racism should work on, but also, for all scholars working on social justice work on. And the third point is really, so from here, where do we go now, right? So we could start from words, but we also need concrete plans for actions. And when taking actions, I'm reflecting upon this for myself as an instructor, but also for myself as people who kind of beginning learning all of the stories that hasn't been told in mainstream scholarship. We need to learn, we need to listen, we need to reflect upon all of this other stories that has been neglected, and based upon that, we need to take actions. And lastly, but perhaps more importantly, we need resources, right? So we begin from universities, we begin the solidarity building process from here, but we need resources to bring in the initiative beyond campuses and to actually working with the broader society, so that we can on our path toward racial justice, so we can actually achieve that ultimate goal. So with that, so on behalf of the academic advisory committee, we truly thankful for all of the greeting events unfolded over the past 2 days. And with that, I'm going to pass this back to Gabe.
Thank you, Sibo. Clearly, there was a lot to learn from today's sessions and from the forum as a whole. On behalf of the organizing team, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us and for all of your contributions to these critical conversations. To our many speakers, thank you. Your voices, thoughts, and experiences are what will lead us forward from here. And finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't take a moment to acknowledge the incredible work of our organizing team. I truly believe that teamwork makes the dream work, and we've had an incredible group of students, faculty, and staff who have worked tirelessly over the last few months to adapt to the world of virtual events. They've stayed up late for many nights in meetings and work sessions and liaised with hundreds of people from across the country. Your hard work will live on through the important conversations that have filled this forum. To our session support staff, many of which are students, you continue to amaze me with your confidence, charisma, and undoubtable capability. This event would not have been possible without you, so thank you. Before we close this forum, I'd like to invite our closing remarks speakers, Ryerson University's President Mohamed Lashemi, Chancellor Janice Fukakuza, and Dean of Arts Pam Sugerman, to say a few final words. First, we'll hear from President Lashemi. Over to you.
Thank you all for joining this important conversation over the past 2 days. Hearing firsthand from students, faculty, staff, and other academic and community leaders was extremely rewarding. It is both reassuring and distressing to see the common experiences so many of us have shared, and to know that we have a great deal of work ahead. But I am inspired to continue the critical work already underway at Ryerson University and beyond. The work of creating more equitable, safe, and inclusive spaces and experiences at Canada's universities. In particular, I look forward to exploring some of the exciting ideas shared during the forum, and to work at building the collaborations that will allow us to truly act together. I believe that working together is the way forward, the way to create a better future. Thank you again for your time and dedication. I am pleased now to introduce our Chancellor, Janice Fukakusa.
Thank you, President Lashemi. I wish to begin by acknowledging that the land on which our university sits is the traditional territory of the Mississauga New Credit First Nation. I want to thank them for allowing us to use their land. I echo our President's thanks for your commitment to participating in this essential dialogue. I'm deeply grateful to all our speakers who brought invaluable insights and perspectives to our discussion. It is also wonderful to be able to continue learning about the issues that are so important to me and to see the dedication in tackling these issues and breaking down barriers. It's wonderful to be able to hear about the importance of truly understanding where we are today, the status quo, and having the data we need to make fully informed plans and choices. It was very interesting in the discussions about the types and quality of data that we have, as well as the different kinds of knowledge and insights that we should consider. And I was moved by some of the powerful and in many cases, very personal stories and experiences that the panelists shared over the past 2 days. I was also struck by the importance of not only building solidarities within and across racialized and marginalized groups, but of taking an intersectional, interdisciplinary approach to doing so. And one of the most powerful messages I heard over the past 2 days is that we must be willing to question everything, from the way we empower members of our communities to the way we teach and to the very space that we occupy. I recognize that some of these ideas are big, even audacious, but that's the kind of thinking we need. As someone who spent over 30 years on the corporate side, breaking through glass ceilings, I know what it takes to create change. And I have seen what is possible. And I also have seen how much work we still have to do. And that's why I'm dedicated to championing equity, diversity, and inclusion across our communities, and why I'm so honored to be part of this forum. Before I let you go, I would like to once again thank all of our sponsors. They made this whole dialogue possible. And our supporters include the Office of the Provost at Ryerson University, University of Toronto, Ontario Confederation of University Faculty Associations, and the Shiseido and Takeda companies from the private sector. Our session supporters are the University of Manitoba Institute for Humanities, the Asian Institute at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto, the Human Rights Commission of the National Association of Japanese Canadians, and the Federation for Humanities and Social Sciences. The friends who have also contributed are QP 3904, the Ryerson Faculty Association, and the Ryerson University Office of Sexual Violence, Support, and Education. So thank you all. I would now like to turn the proceedings over to Pamela Sugerman, Dean of the Faculty of Arts, for her final words. Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor Fukakusa and President Lashemi. You've both captured a number of the many powerful messages that have emerged throughout this forum. The insights and ideas that our participants have shared certainly resonate with me as well. I'll take time to reflect on the meaningful conversations that we've heard, as well as the poignant emotions that were generated over the past 2 days. I already, though, feel energized and inspired to move forward. With this forum, we chose the theme of building solidarities. Why solidarities? In highlighting the concept of solidarity, we hope to advance a deeper and more nuanced understanding of the experiences and histories of the different groups of people who make up our university communities. And in doing so, we also wanted to reinforce the need to avoid conflation of the experiences and impact of racism on people's lives. Further, we set out to understand the relationship between individual experiences of racism, the interpersonal and systemic racism in the academy. And finally, we wish to acknowledge the role of intersectionality in discussions of racism and in advocacy work. So as we develop strategies for transformative change, we will work within our communities, but we will also work together in solidarity. In closing, I'd be remiss in not stating emphatically that this forum would not have been possible without our staff and volunteers, our sponsors, and our participants. In particular, I wish to publicly applaud the outstanding work of Gabe, Ciufo, and Josel Gerardo, both of whom have dedicated themselves to making this forum a meaningful event. I'm also very thankful to all of you for taking the time to participate in the National Forum on Anti-Asian Racism, Building Solidarities. We hope that you found this experience to be a thought-provoking and engaging one, and we look forward to working together again in building a more equitable future for all. I do wish to pass the baton on now to the University of Manitoba, who will, in the next several months, be working with us in collaboration and taking up this challenge. Thank you.